It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, or at least it seemed that way. The fluorescent lights hummed above the office hallway as employees walked briskly, minds consumed by their workday routines. In one corner of the building, near the restroom, a conversation was taking place that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. A manager, someone who was usually in charge of maintaining the order and discipline of the office, stood just outside the men's restroom. He leaned casually against the wall, his tone loud enough for anyone passing by to hear, as he mocked the janitor, who had been diligently cleaning the floors for years. His voice, dripping with condescension, made fun of the elderly black man who had just stepped into the restroom. The janitor, with his stooped posture and slow gait, had no idea that the words of ridicule were directed at him. He had been quietly doing his job, unaware of the mockery going on just a few feet away. It was a scene many would have brushed off as an isolated moment of workplace cruelty, but the truth was much darker. The manager's laughter echoed down the hallway, a sharp contrast to the older man's respectful silence. He had been working at this company for over a decade, cleaning the restrooms, mopping the floors, and doing what was often seen as the unnoticed work. His quiet dignity had earned him respect from some, but he was always a background figure to most of the people around him. Today, however, something would happen that would change everything. As the mocking continued, the older janitor unknowingly entered the restroom and walked toward a stall. The manager, still outside, made no attempt to stop his cruel words, unaware of the power his actions might have. What the manager didn't know was that the elderly man was no ordinary janitor. His experience and wisdom stretched beyond what anyone could see. Inside the restroom, the older man sat in the stall, unaware that a set of eyes was watching his every move from a hidden vantage point. What the manager couldn't have known, what no one could have guessed, was that someone was listening, someone who could very well change the course of what was about to happen. And this someone was far closer than anyone realized. The restroom grew silent as the mocking died down, and for a moment, the air seemed to thicken with tension. Who was this person in the stall, and what would they do? The manager, still unaware, stood waiting just outside. The janitor, unaware of the words said about him, continued to do his job with the same quiet grace he had always shown. What came next, no one could have predicted. What happens when someone decides that enough is enough? The janitor's reaction would not only reveal his own story, but also expose the hidden layers of disrespect and racism buried in the office. The manager, too, would soon learn a lesson that no one could have taught him until now. But as the minutes ticked by, the question remained, how would this all unfold? What choice would the person in the stall make? And would the manager face the consequences of his actions? Stay tuned to find out, because this story is far from over. The silence in the restroom stretched on, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the manager remained oblivious, his voice slowly fading into the distance as he turned and walked away, probably headed back to his desk, satisfied with the small moment of superiority he had just enjoyed. The fluorescent lights flickered for a moment, the only sign of life in the otherwise still space. Inside the stall, the elderly janitor sat, his hands resting on his knees. He had heard it all, every word, every sneer. But instead of reacting, he stayed calm. He had been through too much to let a few careless words shake him. His life hadn't been easy, far from it. Growing up in a world that saw him as less than, always second class, had taught him a few things. One of them was that it wasn't always worth it to fight back. Sometimes it was better to let things play out, let the world reveal its true colors. But that didn't mean he wasn't deeply hurt by the mockery. After all, who wouldn't be? It wasn't the first time he had been ridiculed in this very building. For as long as he could remember, the janitor had been in this line of work, a job that most people barely noticed, much less appreciated. The office workers came and went, rushing through their busy days, while he quietly cleaned up after them, never once expecting anything in return except the chance to keep working, to keep his small slice of dignity intact. He had long ago stopped hoping for recognition. He had stopped dreaming of a world where people treated him as an equal. Life had a way of wearing a person down, making them resign to their place in the world. But every now and then, just like today, something happened that reignited that old fragile hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the same. The janitor stood slowly, the creaking of his knees the only sound in the store. He didn't rush. There was no reason to. He finished his work as methodically as he always did, making sure every corner of the restroom was spotless. He adjusted his worn uniform, the name tag on his chest a little frayed, but still readable. It read James. That was who he was. He was James, and he had been here for more years than anyone could remember, quietly doing his job. The building's employees came and went, but he remained the unspoken fixture of the office. It was a world that didn't care for him, yet he had learned to live in it. He had raised his children, seen them grow, and had his share of joy in life. But like most people, his struggles were real, and he had learned to live with them. The sharp edges of life had worn him down, but he still stood strong, the way someone who had survived so much learned to do. The fact that he was black, older, and in a lowly position at the company meant that there was always someone ready to look down on him. Today, it was the manager, another cog in the corporate machine, rising in the ranks, thinking his position gave him the right to belittle others. James, though, wasn't the type to seek revenge. That wasn't who he was. But something about the manager's mocking tone had struck a nerve deep inside him. It reminded him of all the other times he had been looked down upon, dismissed, and treated as invisible. It wasn't just today. It was years of accumulated frustration, years of having to swallow his pride and keep his mouth shut. How many times had he been ignored, asked to clean up after the very people who would never even glance his way again? How many times had they treated him like nothing more than a piece of furniture? The manager's mockery was the straw that broke the camel's back. But it wasn't just about this one moment. It was about every moment that had led up to it. Outside, the office continued to hum with its usual rhythm. People moved through the hallways, exchanging pleasantries, focused on their work. They were blissfully unaware of the small drama unfolding just a few feet away. No one had seen the manager make his cruel remarks. No one had heard the elderly janitor's silent response, and no one knew what was going on inside that restroom. To them, it was just another day, just another set of mundane tasks to complete. But to James, it was more than that. It was a turning point, a moment that felt different. A moment where, for the first time in a long while, he was ready to stand up for himself. It wasn't about anger or retaliation. It was about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth. No one had ever given him that chance, and maybe, just maybe, today would be the day he finally took it. The door to the restroom opened with a faint click, the sound so subtle that it almost went unnoticed. James, still inside the stall, heard the footsteps approaching. A new figure had entered, the person who had been listening all along. They had been in the stall the entire time, hidden from view. James hadn't noticed their presence earlier, but now he could hear the faint rustling of clothing, the slow and deliberate steps toward the door. Was it someone who had been there the entire time, someone who had overheard everything? He wasn't sure, but he could feel the tension in the air now. Someone was here, someone who had witnessed everything, and that felt like a small, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. Was this person just another office worker, uninterested in the drama that had just unfolded, or did they know something more? Did they see the truth in what had just happened? Or was this just another one of those days, where everything remained the same, and nothing changed? James opened the door to the stall, his worn shoes clicking softly on the tile floor as he stepped out. His movements were slow, deliberate. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time in a long time, he felt eyes on him, someone paying attention. The manager had walked away, but now there was someone else. Someone whose presence in the restroom was not an accident. He didn't know who they were, but they had been listening. And that, for James, was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. James stepped out of the stall, his hands slightly shaking, though he tried to hide it. The restroom was still and silent, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound that filled the space. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being invisible. It was something different. A sense of awareness in the room, a shift in the energy that he couldn't explain. He glanced toward the mirror, half expecting to see a reflection of someone standing behind him. But there was nothing. Just his tired, worn face staring back at him, the years etched into his features. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease, and moved toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, the soft sound of footsteps made him freeze. Someone was coming closer, footsteps slow and deliberate, as if the person were weighing every step, unsure of how to proceed. James' hand faltered on the door, and he turned, almost instinctively, to face the source of the sound. It was a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, his tie slightly loosened, his hair messy as if he had just walked in from the chaos of a busy morning. He looked familiar, someone he had seen around the office, but never really talked to. One of the office workers. He wasn't one of the usual group that treated James like a background figure. But James had always noticed the subtle glances, the awkward silences when his presence was acknowledged. This man wasn't mocking him, at least not overtly, but there was something in his expression now, something that gave James pause. The younger man cleared his throat. Hey, James, right? His voice was unsure, like he was trying to sound casual but couldn't quite mask the tension. Yeah, that's me, James replied, his tone measured, though the familiar feeling of being judged crept into his words. He didn't know why this young man, someone he'd never spoken to, suddenly felt so much more significant. But he couldn't shake the suspicion that this moment, right here, was important. I just wanted to say something, the young man continued, his words hesitant, as if he was carefully choosing them. I heard what that guy was saying, the manager. He paused, almost as if waiting for James to react. It wasn't right. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the younger man. He had expected this moment in some way, but not like this. He had imagined maybe someone would confront the manager later, or maybe someone would offer a quiet word of support. But this felt different. There was a weight in the air now, a shift, as if something was about to break wide open. I don't think he knows what it's like for people like you know. The young man's voice cracked slightly, a sign of his inner conflict. I don't want to be like him. James could see the internal struggle in the young man's eyes. He wasn't entirely sure what this conversation was supposed to be, but he could sense a deep-seated discomfort in the man's voice, an unease with the situation that went beyond just the manager's cruelty. This wasn't just about standing up to a bully. It was something more personal, something deeper, as if this moment was forcing the younger man to confront something about his own role in the world, about how he viewed the people around him. The older man let the silence stretch for a moment longer before he finally spoke. You don't have to apologize for him. His voice was quiet but firm. He doesn't represent everyone here. The young man seemed to relax a bit, though there was still a tinge of guilt in his posture. I know, but that doesn't make it right. And I don't know how to make it better. James thought for a moment. The truth was, he didn't know how to make it better either. He had spent so many years trying to keep his head down, trying to stay out of the way, that he had never really considered how to change things. He had never really believed he could. He had watched people like the manager climb the ranks, get the praise, while he did the dirty work in the background. He had been content to let them think what they wanted about him, content to accept the scraps they tossed his way. But now, here was someone, this young man, who was reaching out, someone who was trying to bridge a gap, someone who was genuinely bothered by the injustice. I'm not asking for anything, James said slowly, his words coming with a heaviness he had never allowed to show before. I've learned to live with it. But you don't have to live with it too. Not if you don't want to. The younger man looked down, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't want to be the kind of person who just ignores it. I see people like you doing this hard work, and it's like they think we don't matter. Like we're invisible. And that's not right. It's not. It's not fair. The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they were the truth James had been trying to bury for so long. That feeling of invisibility, of being treated like nothing, was a constant companion. It had shaped every aspect of his life. He had lived in a world where people like him were expected to be quiet, to accept their place, to never challenge the system. But now, in this quiet restroom, there was something stirring, something that had been buried deep for years. James wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he didn't care, that he didn't feel the weight of every moment of disrespect, of every glance that avoided him, of every snide comment whispered behind closed doors. The manager's mockery had been the final straw, but it wasn't just about him. It was about the system that allowed people like the manager to rise, to treat others like they were disposable. The tension in the air grew thicker, the silence more oppressive. The young man, still standing there, seemed unsure of what to do next. James could feel the conflict inside him as well. There was a part of him that just wanted to leave, to walk away, to let it go as he always had. But there was also a part of him that knew, deep down, that this moment was different. Maybe it wasn't too late to make a change. Maybe it wasn't too late for someone to stand up, even if it was just one person. But that one person, that small spark, was still in the early stages of igniting. And neither of them knew just how far this would go, how much this moment would affect both their lives, how it would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and the world around them. Neither James nor the young man could have predicted what would happen next. And with each passing second, the question loomed larger. Would anyone have the courage to break the silence? The silence between them felt heavier with every passing second. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how tightly wound the world around him had become. The younger man shifted on his feet, glancing nervously at the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. But no one came. It was just the two of them, caught in a tense moment that neither could escape from. James could sense the unease in the young man. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was something deeper, something almost palpable. He wanted to say something, something to ease the tension, to assure the man that it wasn't his fault, that the fight wasn't his to carry. But the words didn't come. Instead, he stood there, locked in the uncomfortable realization that neither of them knew how to fix this. Outside the restroom, the office continued as usual. The low murmur of conversations, the clacking of keyboards, the hum of the air conditioning. All these sounds felt so far away. The world outside seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside this small, quiet space. But in this moment, it felt as if everything was on the edge of snapping. James couldn't help but think about the years of degradation, of being overlooked, of having to live in a world that never truly saw him. It all felt like it was coming to a head. One small comment, one unexpected moment, and everything could change. The young man shifted again, his eyes wide as if he was searching for something to say. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. It was as if everything he wanted to say had been swallowed up by the thick air between them. I don't know what to do, James, he finally whispered. I just don't know. James stood there, staring at him. The younger man's face was a mixture of frustration and helplessness, his eyes flickering with that deep internal conflict. He wasn't the one who had been wronged, yet he felt the weight of the moment as if it were his own. It was a look James knew all too well, a look of wanting to help but not knowing how, a look of being trapped in a system that didn't offer any easy answers. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the quiet rustle of paper in the distance, the faint clicks of shoes echoing down the hallway. It was as though the whole world had been muted, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. In that space, everything felt fragile, too fragile to move, too fragile to break. James' mind raced. He thought about the years of working in silence, of cleaning up after people who barely acknowledged his existence. He thought about his children, how he had taught them to endure, to stay quiet, to accept the things they couldn't change. But standing here now, in this cramped, sterile restroom, with this young man in front of him, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that maybe this time, things had to change. But what could one person do? What could one moment of confrontation really accomplish? He was just a janitor, a nameless, faceless figure in the background of a world that never asked for his story. He had always believed that people like him didn't have the luxury of standing up. People like him had to keep their heads down, had to endure. The system was too big, too powerful. But now, with the young man standing before him, with the echoes of the manager's mocking laughter still hanging in the air, James wasn't so sure anymore. The door to the restroom swung open again, this time with more force than before. James turned, his heart skipping a beat. A figure stood there, silhouetted by the harsh office lights from the hallway. It was the manager, the very person whose words had sparked this moment. His presence seemed to cut through the air like a knife, sharp and unwelcome. He looked at the two men in the restroom, his gaze sweeping from James to the young man, his expression unreadable. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. "Is there a problem here?" The manager's voice was low, almost too calm, as though he had already decided what he wanted the answer to be. James felt a surge of something inside him. Anger, defiance, maybe even fear. The manager didn't even try to hide the smugness in his posture, as if he were enjoying the tension in the room. The young man beside James stiffened, his body language betraying his discomfort. The manager took a step inside the restroom, his eyes flicking between them, as if he were measuring the situation. His smirk only deepened as he saw the younger man's nervousness. "Don't tell me you two are having a heart-to-heart in here. What's the deal, huh? We all know what the job is, James. Don't get too worked up. It's just how things are." James could feel the blood rushing in his ears. The manager's words were sharp, like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the sense of superiority that seemed to radiate off him. James had spent so many years letting people like this talk down to him. But now, in this moment, something inside him finally snapped. The young man shifted again, clearly caught between a desire to say something and an instinct to stay out of the line of fire. James saw it in his eyes. He was torn, unsure of whether to speak up or to retreat. And that hesitation, that moment of uncertainty, felt like a pressure building in the air. The manager's presence was suffocating, and James knew that this was it. The moment was here. The choice to remain silent or to finally stand up was before him. But as the tension stretched to its breaking point, the unexpected happened. The young man, his fists clenched at his sides, looked directly at the manager. His voice was quiet, but firm. "No, it's not just how things are, it's wrong." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a defiance that both surprised and shocked James. For a long moment, the three of them stood there, locked in a standoff. The manager's face hardened, his eyes narrowing in a mixture of confusion and anger. It was as if he hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, least of all this young man who had always kept to the background. James could feel the air crackling with intensity. Something had shifted, something had changed. But neither man knew yet what the outcome would be. Neither of them knew how far this would go. But there was no turning back now. The moment had arrived, and the tension in the room reached its peak. What would happen next? Would the young man's words be enough to confront the system, to confront the manager's cruelty? Or would this moment fizzle out, just another failed attempt at change? No one could say for sure yet, but the next few seconds would decide everything. The tension in the room thickened as the manager's eyes flickered between the young man and James, the surprise quickly turning into something darker. The young man had spoken up, but there was something almost too real in his words, something that made the manager's position feel suddenly fragile. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The silence was suffocating. Then, without warning, the door to the restroom opened again, this time with a force that made both men flinch. The sound of heels clicking sharply against the tile floor echoed through the air. James didn't have to turn around to know who it was. He had seen her around the office often enough. It was the HR director, the very person who was supposed to handle complaints, but had always seemed more interested in maintaining the company's image than addressing the real issues. She stepped into the restroom, her gaze sweeping across the three of them. The HR director's eyes flickered for just a second as she took in the scene. The manager standing with that arrogant smirk, the young man standing his ground, and James, the elderly janitor, caught in the middle of it all. There was no mistaking the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had walked into something she wasn't prepared for. Someone who knew she would have to clean up a mess, but wasn't sure where to begin. "Everything okay in here?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she were trying to defuse the situation before it even had a chance to escalate. The young man, still standing tall, looked at her, but his shoulders slumped slightly as the realization hit him. This was the person who had the power to make things right, but in his gut, he knew it wouldn't happen. Not here. Not now. There was something about the HR director's presence that made it clear she wasn't on their side, no matter how she tried to act. James, too, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. He had seen enough in his years at the company to understand how this game was played. HR wasn't about fairness. It was about smoothing things over, about protecting the company and its image, no matter the cost. If anyone had any illusions left about fairness or justice, they were about to be shattered in that instant. The manager smiled, almost smugly, as if this new development had worked in his favor. "Just a little misunderstanding," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Nothing to worry about." The HR director's gaze flicked over to James, and for the first time, her expression seemed to soften, just a fraction. "James," she said, her voice now a little quieter, a little more rehearsed. "Can I have a word with you, just outside for a moment?" James knew what that meant. It meant they wanted to separate him from the others, to take him away and try to talk him down, to make sure he didn't say anything that would cause real trouble. He had been down this road before, many times, and he could already hear the rehearsed lines they would feed him. "Don't make waves. Don't upset the status quo." His heart sank. But before he could respond, the young man spoke again, his voice louder, more determined this time. "You can't just sweep this under the rug, not anymore. We've all seen it. He's been treating people like this for years." His words hit like a hammer, each one ringing with truth. "And you know it." The HR director stiffened at the accusation, her eyes narrowing for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. "I don't think this is the right place for this kind of discussion," she said, her tone now cold, professional, detached. "James, please. Let's go outside and talk this over." James wanted to say something. He really did, but his mouth felt dry. He could feel the pressure mounting, the familiar weight of knowing that this conversation, like all the others before it, wouldn't end in any meaningful way. But before he could move toward the door, the young man stepped forward, blocking his path. "You can't do this," the young man said, his voice fierce now. "This isn't just about some office spat. This is about real people. People who deserve respect. You can't just push it aside." For a moment, the HR director hesitated, caught off guard by the young man's conviction. But only for a moment. She quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her voice growing colder. "This is a workplace, and we handle things the proper way. If you want to make an official complaint, James can file it, and we'll deal with it through the appropriate channels. But I'm asking you to step back." The young man was seething, his fists clenched at his sides. James could feel the energy shift in the room. Something was about to break, and neither he nor the young man could stop it now. He knew what was coming next, and a wave of dread washed over him. This wasn't just about standing up to the manager anymore. It was about taking on the entire system, the very structure that had been built to protect people like the manager, to keep things running smoothly, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher, and James felt the weight of that reality settling on him. Then, in the split second before anything could escalate further, something unexpected happened. The manager, his eyes still smug, suddenly turned toward the door with a quick glance toward the HR director. He didn't say a word, he just made a small motion with his head. A barely noticeable shift that might have been missed by anyone else. But James saw it. It was a signal, a silent command. Before anyone could process it, the manager's phone rang, its sharp, insistent tone cutting through the tension in the room. He answered it quickly, his voice lowering as he spoke into the phone, but James could see the change in his demeanor. The smugness disappeared, replaced by something else, something almost nervous. "I have to take this," the manager said abruptly, his eyes darting between James, the young man, and the HR director. "We'll talk about this later. There's nothing to see here." And with that, he turned and walked out of the restroom, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. The HR director's gaze lingered for a moment on James and the young man, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she followed the manager, disappearing through the door. For a second, it was as if the world had exhaled, releasing the tension that had been building for what felt like hours. But something felt off, something was hanging in the air, unresolved, like a storm waiting to hit. James and the young man stood there, in that small restroom, both feeling the weight of what had just happened. The conversation had shifted, and with it, so had the stakes. But what had just transpired? What was that signal from the manager? What did it mean for what was to come? Neither of them knew yet, but one thing was certain: the storm wasn't over. The moment the manager walked out, a strange silence hung in the air. James stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The young man beside him hadn't moved, his body still rigid, as though waiting for something, some sign that this was the end, or maybe just the beginning. James felt the weight of the years, years of feeling invisible, years of swallowing insults, of silently enduring the unspoken rules of a world built on power and privilege. The sting of the manager's arrogance still lingered in his mind, but now, as he stood there in the small restroom with the young man, something felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about keeping quiet or letting things go. It was about standing up, about making a statement that wouldn't be so easily dismissed. The young man spoke first, his voice hoarse but determined. "What just happened? Why did he act like that?" James didn't know how to answer. The manager's behavior was unsettling, unpredictable, and it only added to the confusion of the situation. But one thing was clear: the moment they had just shared was the beginning of something, whether they were ready for it or not. Without saying a word, James walked toward the door. The young man followed closely behind, and as they stepped out into the hallway, they were met with a sight that neither of them expected. The HR director stood there, her back stiff, her eyes scanning the space as if she were making sure no one had overheard their conversation. "James, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But her tone was different now, no longer cold and professional. There was something vulnerable in it, something James wasn't used to hearing from someone in her position. The young man looked at James, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is she doing here?" James didn't answer right away. His mind was racing. This wasn't part of the script he had expected. The HR director had always been a symbol of the corporate system, the one who swept things under the rug. who made sure everything looked neat and tidy on the surface. But now, there was a change in her demeanor, something that suggested she wasn't as unaffected by everything as she'd let on. She stepped forward, lowering her voice even more. "You need to hear me out, James. Please, it's not what you think." James hesitated. He knew the risks of engaging with someone like her. He had spent too many years watching people like her manipulate situations to their advantage. But there was something about the way she was standing, the way she looked at him, something that made him wonder if she was really trying to help or if this was just another game. The young man, sensing the shift, took a step back. "What's going on? What aren't you telling us?" The HR director glanced at him, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "It's complicated," she began, her voice catching. "But I'm trying to make things right. I'm not who you think I am." James' heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something genuine in her eyes. Something that suggested that the wheels of power and control were beginning to shift in a way he hadn't anticipated. "You know about the manager, don't you?" The HR director continued, her voice trembling. "What happened today? It's not the first time. He's been getting away with this for a long time. And I've been turning a blind eye. I didn't know how to stop it." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had suspected for a long time that the manager was not an isolated case, that the power structure in the office had allowed these kinds of behaviors to thrive. But to hear it from her, to hear her admit that she had been complicit in it, was both shocking and somehow freeing. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't want to be part of this anymore. I've seen the damage it's caused. I've seen how it's broken people like you, James. People who have given so much and been treated like nothing. And I can't let it continue. I've been working behind the scenes to gather evidence. Proof of what he's done, the things he's gotten away with." James' mind spun. This was something he hadn't expected. He thought it was just the two of them, the manager and the HR director, playing their roles, maintaining the status quo. But now, there was a third player in the game, someone who was willing to fight back, someone who had seen the cracks in the system, and wasn't willing to let them go unchallenged. The young man looked at James, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you telling me that she's been on our side this whole time?" James didn't know how to answer. He couldn't quite trust what he was hearing. But something in her voice, something in the way she spoke, made him wonder if she was telling the truth. "I have to ask you to trust me," the HR director said, her voice low. "I'm not asking you to forget what's happened. But I need your help. I can't do this alone." The words settled in the air, hanging between them like a heavy burden. James felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't the resolution he had expected. This wasn't the neat, tidy ending where everyone just walked away, leaving the office behind them. This was something bigger, something that threatened to unravel everything he had known, everything he had accepted. And just as the weight of her words began to sink in, a final twist hit like a hammer. And just as the weight of her words began to sink in, a final twist hit like a hammer. The door to the office opened behind them with a soft creak. James turned to see the manager standing there once more, his eyes wide and frantic. His voice was low, almost pleading. "James, don't listen to her. You don't know what she's really capable of. You don't know what she's been hiding. It's all a game. She's lying to you." The tension in the hallway snapped. The manager's sudden reappearance had thrown everything into chaos, and now James had to decide. Was this just another attempt to control the narrative? Or was the HR director telling the truth? Was she really trying to make things right? Or was she just another player in a system designed to maintain power no matter the cost? James' heart raced, his mind clouded with doubt. The stakes had never been higher. What happened next would determine everything, not just for him, but for everyone in this office. What side would he choose? And more importantly, who could he trust? Before he could make a decision, the HR director spoke again, her voice trembling. "I'm not lying, James. This is your chance to change everything. To expose the truth. Don't let him win. And in that moment, the truth seemed almost within reach, but everything hung in the balance. The final decision was his and the young man's. The truth was on the table, but the path to it was clouded with danger, deceit, and uncertainty. The story wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The hallway felt quieter now, the tension palpable as James stood between the two conflicting forces. The HR director was standing with her hands trembling slightly, her face flushed with the weight of everything she had just confessed. The manager, on the other hand, stood frozen, his once confident demeanor cracked, revealing a desperation that was almost impossible to ignore. James knew that the moment ahead was going to define everything. The way his story, the story of so many who had suffered in silence, would unfold from this point forward. There was no going back now. His entire life had been spent staying out of the way, enduring the subtle and not so subtle racism, the mockery, the disrespect that had been passed off as just another part of office culture. But now, standing here, he realized that his silence had only allowed it to persist. The young man stood beside him, his eyes still wide with disbelief, but a flicker of hope now danced behind them. James could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about just surviving the day-to-day grind. This was bigger than that. It was about standing up for what was right, for what he and so many others had suffered in silence for far too long. James, the young man said quietly, almost as if sensing the internal battle that was playing out inside him, "We have to do something about this. We can't let him get away with it. We can't let her keep covering it up either." The words hit harder than expected. They were raw, powerful, and yet strangely reassuring. He wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like the only one willing to take a stand. James took a deep breath and turned back to the HR director. "You say you want to help. You say you've been gathering evidence. What happens now?" His voice was steady, though the weight of it carried a depth of skepticism. She nodded, her expression serious. "I have everything you need. The proof of his behavior, the way he's manipulated the system, everything. But we need to act fast. He's going to fight back. He's already been informed, unsure of it." The manager, hearing his name mentioned, stiffened, but still kept a wary distance. His eyes darted to the door, as if he were trying to calculate his next move. James could see it. He was trying to figure out his escape, to turn the tables in his favor, but the manager's bravado was no longer convincing. The stakes had shifted. James could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, and he wasn't the only one noticing them. "This isn't over," the manager muttered, taking a step back toward the door. "You'll regret this, all of you." James couldn't help but notice the fear that had replaced his earlier arrogance. The power was shifting. The truth was coming to light, and the manager, once untouchable, was beginning to realize that his time was running out. With a deep final breath, James looked at the HR director and then at the young man. "We can't let him get away with it," he said, his voice firm, the decision now made. "Let's take this to the top. Let's go straight to the board. I've seen enough." The HR director's eyes softened, relief washing over her face. "You're making the right choice," she said. "Together, we can make sure he never does this again." The HR director's eyes softened, relief washing over her face. "You're making the right choice," she said. "Together, we can make sure he never does this again." James and the young man, both emboldened by their shared decision, walked out of the office together. The HR director was right behind them, ready to take the evidence to the board of directors, ready to do everything in her power to expose the manager's toxic behavior for the world to see. The young man's eyes were alight with determination as they walked toward the elevator. As they passed the other employees who had silently observed the scene, James felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The culture of silence, the tolerance of abuse, was beginning to crumble. People were beginning to speak out, to demand change. The journey to this point had been long, filled with years of frustration, silence, and hidden pain. But now, with one action, one decision, James was standing up for every single person who had been overlooked, underestimated, or mistreated. They reached the elevator and stepped inside, the doors closing behind them. It was only then that James allowed himself a small smile. A smile that was more for the future than for the present. The elevator ride felt different, lighter, as if the weight of years had been lifted from his shoulders. As they reached the top floor, they were greeted by the board of directors, who had already been made aware of the situation. They sat in silence as James and the HR director presented the evidence, detailing the manager's behavior, his mistreatment of employees, and his many violations of company policies. The board listened intently, and for the first time, James felt like he was being heard. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He wasn't the invisible figure in the background. He was someone with a voice, someone whose experiences and pain mattered. The board convened for a long time, but when they returned, it was with a decision that left no room for doubt. The manager would be terminated immediately. His actions had been unacceptable, and the company could no longer stand by and let such behavior continue unchecked. As the meeting concluded, the young man looked at James, his eyes full of admiration. "You did it," he said. "You really did it." James nodded, his heart swelling with pride, though he knew this victory was only the beginning. It wasn't just about one person losing their job. It was about the start of a new era, one where people could no longer be treated as invisible, where systemic racism and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Walking out of the office, James felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. He was no longer bound by fear, no longer silent in the face of injustice. The truth had been heard, and it had made all the difference. As he left the building, the young man beside him clapped him on the back. "I can't believe it. We actually did it." James smiled again, this time more genuinely. "We did it together, and that's how we'll keep doing it." The world outside was still the same, but James knew that it had changed for him, for the young man, and for everyone who had ever felt invisible or powerless. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he had hoped that it could be won. And with that, he stepped into the unknown, ready for whatever came next, knowing that no matter the obstacles, he would no longer be silenced.